Julian West once walked into his own funeral, not as a ghost, but as a man who had survived the silence they used to bury him. Declared dead by his own parents for being gay, erased from legal records, written off with a false death certificate, and a eulogy read without remorse. But Julian had returned, not to ask for love, but to reclaim something more powerful, his existence. 2 months after the courtroom victory that restored his legal identity, Julian thought it was over. He was back in Vancouver, declining media requests, keeping his name out of headlines, and focusing on something quiet: writing. Not for revenge, not for closure, but to finally tell the story they tried to write without him. For the first time in years, his name was his again, and he believed maybe that was enough. Until the envelope appeared at his doorstep. It was thick, manila, and unmarked. The kind of letter that doesn't carry greetings, only demands. Inside, a cease and desist notice from a law firm he recognized immediately, the same firm his father had used to manage the family's inheritance trust. The letter read plainly, coldly: Mr. Julian West is hereby ordered to cease using the West family name or referencing family members in any public content, including but not limited to published works, media interviews, or online platforms. Any further violations will result in legal action. No explanation, no context, not even a pretense of civility. Just another attempt to bury him, this time with ink and intimidation. Julian stood in the kitchen, staring at the letter on the counter. It lay in the same spot where his coffee mug had once shattered, the day he saw the funeral they held without a body. That was the first time they declared him gone, and now they were trying again. This time to silence the voice he fought so hard to recover. He didn't speak. He just picked up his phone, scrolled through contacts, and paused on a name: the attorney who had helped him overturn the fake death certificate. He didn't call her, not yet. Instead, he opened a blank note and typed one sentence: if they want silence, they'll have to pay for what it cost me. 3 days later, Julian walked into the same Portland Mall office where he'd once proven he was still alive. He didn't come with a plea. He came with evidence, intent, and a quiet rage that no longer trembled. He opened a new case, this time to challenge the theft, the forgery, and the erasure that went beyond a piece of paper. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every queer person whose name had been crossed out for someone else's comfort. In his mind, he kept replaying the look in his mother's eyes during the church that day, not anger, not grief, just vacancy, like she had forgotten how to see him. Julian wasn't seeking an apology. He wasn't trying to force love where none had been offered. But he knew one thing: the people who had tried to end his story didn't get to silence the truth just because it was inconvenient. He signed the complaint documents one by one. The ink was still drying, but the resolve had been permanent for years. He remembered what it felt like to be buried alive in silence. This time, he was the one drawing the line and speaking the name they tried to erase louder than ever. What would you do if your family tried to erase you, not with words, but with paperwork? Julian is back, not just for himself, but for everyone who's been made invisible. Subscribe to Heart Stories and follow the next chapter of Julian West, because sometimes survival isn't enough. Sometimes you have to reclaim the ground they buried you in. The courthouse smelled like paper and polish and old wood. Julian remembered that from the first time he'd walked its halls, a living man proving he wasn't dead. Now he returned not as a shadow of a story, but as a plaintiff. This time he wasn't fighting for recognition. He was fighting for accountability. The complaint was filed under 3 charges: falsification of legal documents, financial fraud, and emotional damages linked to the illegal seizure of inheritance funds. It was a lawsuit that should never have existed, and yet it had been born the moment Chloe West, Julian's own younger sister, signed the amendment that erased his name from the family trust. The evidence was clean: emails, financial records, a copy of the death certificate that had been submitted to the state registrar. The same death certificate that had wiped him out of the system was now being used to hold his family to account. Julian's attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Lillian, had warned him, "They will say you're bitter. They'll say you're exploiting this. Are you ready for that?" He had smiled gently. "They buried me," he said. "I'm just planting something in the dirt they left behind." What they didn't know, what even Julian hadn't expected, was what came next. As discovery unfolded, a former clerk from the state office came forward. She had been the one who processed Julian's death certificate. Her voice, hesitant but firm, echoed in the deposition room as she explained how she had been pressured by a family representative to push the document through without standard verification. She hadn't asked questions then. Now she couldn't sleep without seeing Julian's name on that page, as if she'd helped kill someone who wasn't dead. With her testimony, the case became more than a family dispute. It was now a question of systemic failure, and the ease with which erasure could be engineered by those with power and a clean suit. Julian sat quietly as her words sank in. He didn't smile. There was no victory in hearing how little it took to disappear him. But there was clarity, the kind that sharpens a purpose. While the legal team prepared their strategy, Julian spent his evenings walking the city alone. He passed cafes where nobody knew his name, bookstores with windows full of memoirs and recovery guides, and corner stores with bulletin boards full of missing pets and lost keys. He found himself pausing in front of one window, a local photography studio showcasing portraits titled "What Was Left Behind." Faces of people holding objects once stolen, a wedding dress, a school award, a photo album. It wasn't about the objects, it was about the right to be remembered. That night, Julian went home and opened the same wooden box he had carried since he left Virginia. Inside were the things that survived: an old family photo, a report card from 5th grade, and a handwritten note from his grandfather that simply read, "If the family forgets you, remember yourself harder." He read it again and again until the words felt etched into his spine. Maybe this lawsuit wasn't just about money. Maybe it wasn't even about them anymore. It was about what happened when truth gets neglected for too long. It comes back, louder, more insistent, like roots breaking through concrete. In court, Chloe sat stone-faced. Her lawyer claimed she had been acting on assumed legal standing, that she believed Julian was dead, that the money was rightfully reassigned, not stolen. But she never looked at Julian, not once, not when the death certificate was held up in front of her. Not when Julian's signature appeared beside lease agreements dated months after the supposed accident. Not even when the judge asked if she had ever once tried to call him. But Julian didn't need her to look at him, not anymore. The final blow came in the form of a timestamp. An internal email showing Chloe had approved the reallocation of funds 6 weeks after an anonymous call was logged at the trust's hotline. A voice simply asking, "What happens if someone declared dead is still alive?" Chloe never reported it, never paused the transfer. She moved forward anyway, and that was all it took. By the end of the 3rd day, the judge announced that Julian West's claim had legal merit. A full civil trial would proceed. Chloe and the family estate would be required to provide full financial disclosure, including any funds derived from the inheritance Julian had been cut out of. Julian didn't cheer. He didn't collapse in relief. He just exhaled, long and low, as if he'd been holding his breath since the day they read his eulogy. Outside, the sky was overcast. The light was soft, diffuse, the kind that made shadows gentle. Julian stood on the courthouse steps, his hands tucked into his coat, and watched the people pass by. None of them knew what he had just done, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He felt real, not loud, not dramatic, just real. And sometimes that was more than enough. When Julian was a boy, his mother used to tell him not to stare at strangers on the train. "It's rude," she'd say, tapping his hand gently. "It makes people uncomfortable." But what she never explained was why being seen felt so dangerous, or why silence was considered more polite than truth. Now, as he sat inside a courtroom where his very existence was once reduced to paperwork, Julian understood. This trial wasn't just about money. It was about a family who had spent years mastering the art of not seeing. Chloe didn't look at him. His father didn't flinch when the court displayed the falsified documents. They had both rehearsed their detachment like lines in a play. Firm, unwavering, plausible. Julian had expected that. What he hadn't expected was the small, quiet gasp that came from the audience when a new piece of evidence was introduced. The court clerk wheeled in a laptop, connected it to a projector, and pressed play. It was audio, old, fuzzy, recorded through a phone call to the trust's internal helpline. The voice was unmistakable, hesitant, barely above a whisper, but undeniably his mother's. "If someone's been declared dead, And they're not. What happens to the inheritance? There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end asked, "Are you calling on behalf of a beneficiary?" The answer came slowly. "I'm just asking for peace of mind." The courtroom fell completely silent. Julian's breath caught. He turned slightly, not enough to meet her eyes, but just enough to feel her presence. His mother was seated at the end of the defense row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. It had been her. She had known. Not just suspected, she had known. And still, she had said nothing. Not when the casket closed, not when the funds were transferred, not even when Chloe stood beside her and accepted the applause of mourners for hosting the memorial service. Julian had imagined her to be afraid, but now he saw it wasn't fear that had kept her silent. It was something colder, something far more devastating, shame that chose comfort over truth. The court took a recess. Julian stepped outside into the hallway, needing air. The walls felt too tight, the ceiling too low. But before he could escape, a voice called softly behind him. It wasn't the voice of the bailiff or his attorney. "Julian." He turned. His mother stood a few feet away, hands trembling, as if asking for permission to exist in the same frame. "I know I have no right," she said, voice low, "but I need to speak." Julian didn't say anything. Not yes, not no, just stood there, heart ticking like a clock he couldn't reset. She continued, "I didn't sign the form, your father did. He had the lawyer drafted. He said it was the only way to preserve the family trust. I didn't stop him. I didn't stand up for you. And that's not because I believed you were wrong. It's because I couldn't imagine a world where I had to choose you over everything else." She paused, swallowed. "And I see now I didn't lose you because of who you are. I lost you because I wasn't brave enough to deserve you." Julian stared at her. This woman who had once made him tea after nightmares, who knew how to French braid hair even though she only had sons, who kissed his forehead every morning until the day she didn't. She looked older now, but not in the way years make you older, in the way guilt does. "I don't expect forgiveness," she added. I want to remember you as more than a silence." He didn't cry. He didn't reach out. But something in him shifted. Not forgiveness, not even peace, just the beginning of gravity loosening its grip. He nodded barely and turned back toward the courtroom. It wasn't a reconciliation. But it was an opening, and sometimes for people like him, openings were sacred. Later that day, a new witness was called, Julian himself. He took the stand, placed a steady hand on the Bible, and began. He didn't speak of rage. He didn't list every night he had spent wondering if he mattered. He simply told the story of what it felt like to read your own obituary, to be cut out of a photo, to find out the people who raised you had chosen a narrative where you no longer existed. He finished with this: "I never wanted their money. I never needed their permission. I just needed to know that if I walked into a room, someone would say, 'He was here. He mattered.' Yeah, and that no one, no signature, no lie, no fear could ever make that untrue." When he stepped down, the courtroom didn't applaud, but they didn't need to. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of something quiet, heavy, and honest. The verdict came on a Wednesday. It didn't arrive with the bang of a gavel or a dramatic gasp from the room. It came with the flat tone of the court clerk reading out the judgment, the kind of voice trained to sound neutral, no matter what it's delivering. Still, every syllable landed like a stone in Julian's chest. The judge ruled in his favor. The West family estate was ordered to pay full restitution of the inheritance share that had been wrongfully absorbed into Chloe's name. Additionally, a public record of the false death certificate would be amended with an official court note. This document was found to be fraudulent. Julian didn't move. His hands stayed folded in his lap, his back straight. He didn't turn to look at Chloe. He didn't glance at his parents. His eyes remained fixed on a point just above the judge's shoulder, somewhere past the bench, past the courtroom, past the years. For most people, this would be the moment of vindication. For Julian, it felt like a mirror, not one that showed him victorious, but one that showed him whole. Scarred, yes, but not invisible. He stepped outside the courthouse into overcast light. There were reporters, flashes, a microphone shoved near his jawline. He shook his head, polite but firm. No statements, he said, and walked past them. He didn't owe sound bites to a world that only listened when the story had teeth. That night, he sat at his small kitchen table in Vancouver, the court documents in front of him. He stared at them. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just the kind of quiet that follows a long, unfinished thought. Then he opened a browser and searched for something else. Emergency shelters for LGBTQ+ youth. He clicked through sites, names of teens rejected from homes, crisis centers overcrowded, hotline transcripts full of kids who'd said, "I think I'm dead to them now." And then it clicked. Julian had been erased not just on paper, but in practice, in principle, in family. And if it could happen to him, it was happening to others, thousands of others. But unlike him, many of them didn't have proof, didn't have a passport or a lease, or someone who once slipped cookies under their door and sent a video of their fake funeral. Julian did something he never expected to do. He wired the restitution funds into a new account, under a new name, one that didn't carry the family weight anymore, the Undeclared Foundation. He registered it that week, a nonprofit for youth made invisible by the people who were supposed to love them. Not just a shelter, not just legal aid, a space where being erased wasn't the end of your story. He called Lillian, his attorney, and asked if she'd help him with the legal framework. "It's not a case," he said. "It's something I want to build from the ashes." She didn't hesitate. "You're not building from ashes, Julian. You're building from roots they tried to rip out." In the weeks that followed, Julian gave one interview, not with a national network, but with a small, independent queer zine based in Seattle. No studio, no lights. Just him, seated on a park bench, speaking into a recorder held by a nervous 22-year-old journalism student. He didn't tell the whole saga. He just said this: "There are kids out there whose names are already fading from family photos. I don't want to be remembered for winning a lawsuit. I want to be remembered for building a table for the kids who never got a seat." That line made its way online, not viral, not headline news, but it landed somewhere. In the inboxes of kids scrolling late at night, of tired counselors trying to stretch donations, of one mother in Utah who had just kicked her son out and found herself staring at Julian's face and wondering, what if I'm the one writing his obituary with silence? Julian didn't read the comments. He spent his time with architects, with volunteers, with a social worker named Clara who told him, "You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be real." That felt like enough. The building they found for the first Undeclared center was small, an old craftsman home on the edge of the city with chipped paint and a sagging porch. But Julian saw potential, not in the walls, but in the faces he imagined would fill the rooms. The ones who would walk in quiet and scared, and maybe, just maybe, walk out louder. On the day the papers were signed, Julian stood on the front steps and looked up at the crooked roof. He thought of his grandfather's note: "If the family forgets you, remember yourself harder." He had, and now he was building a place for others to do the same. The front door creaked, just slightly, as the first guest entered the Undeclared center. It was a soft sound, but Julian heard it from the hallway, where he was pinning a photograph to the wall. A black and white shot of the courthouse, taken the day he had won the right to exist again. He didn't pose for it. He hadn't even known it was taken. But in the photo, he was walking away, back straight, shoulders squared, leaving the building that once tried to declare him gone. Now he was building something no court could ever undo. The opening night wasn't a gala. There were no champagne glasses or name tags, just folding chairs, paper cups of lemonade, and a mismatched circle of teenagers, volunteers, and survivors. Each of them had found their way there not because they had somewhere to be, but because they'd once had nowhere to go. Among them was a boy named Micah, 11 years old, small for his age, with soft, rounded cheeks and eyes that flickered between shyness and defiance. He wore a worn denim jacket 2 sizes too big and clutched a drawstring bag like it was a shield. His mother, not the one who gave birth to him, but the woman who found him sleeping behind a diner 3 months earlier, stood quietly beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Micah didn't say much that night, not at first. But when Julian introduced himself to the group and invited anyone to speak, the room went still. And then unexpectedly, Micah raised his hand. "I want to say something," he mumbled, eyes down. Julian stepped aside. The boy walked forward, tiny shoes squeaking on the old hardwood floor. He looked out at the room, a space that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and second chances, and began. When I left my house, my dad said I didn't belong. He said I walked wrong, talked wrong, that I made the family look bad. I didn't even say I was gay yet. I just was me. He glanced at Julian, then back to the room. Then I met someone who told me there's no right way to be a kid, and she brought me here. And now, this place feels like the first time I walked into a room and didn't have to hide. He paused, his voice trembled. Julian saved me. He doesn't know me, but he did, because he made this. And if he can come back from being dead and all that, then maybe I can come back too. The room didn't applaud, it didn't need to. Some stories don't end in cheers, they end in silence so full it hums in your chest. Julian's throat tightened. He crossed the room slowly, crouched beside Micah, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You never disappeared," Julian said softly. "They just didn't know how to see you, but we do." That night, after everyone had left, Julian walked the empty hallways. The walls were still bare in some rooms. The furniture was secondhand, but it was enough. In the window of the front room, he taped a printed sign, "Home isn't where you come from, it's where they let you stay." Before locking up, he returned to the photograph wall, now filling steadily with faces and fragments of lives that had refused to vanish. He added a new photo, Micah, mid-laugh, a lopsided grin, and light in his eyes. Below it, he wrote just one word, visible. What if the most powerful thing we can do isn't to fight the people who erased us, but to build something that outlives their silence? Julian West's story isn't just about reclaiming his name. It's about handing that right to exist, to belong, to be seen, to the next person who needs it. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more true stories of courage, truth, and the quiet revolutions that begin with simply showing up. And tell us in the comments, if you had the chance to rewrite the story they told about you, how would it begin?